I never thought the dead could speak until I heard them calling from the depths of an abandoned mine shaft in the Siberian wilderness. What started as a routine geological survey in the remote taiga near Norilsk became something that still haunts me 15 years later. If you've ever heard voices where there shouldn't be any, drop voices in the comments, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about what lies beneath the frozen ground of Siberia. My name is Dr. Marcus Webb, and I've spent the better part of my career studying mineral deposits in some of the most isolated places on Earth. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what we discovered in the winter of 2009 in a place the locals refuse to name. They just call it the Hungry Ground, and after what happened there, I understand why. It was February, and the temperature was hovering around -40 degrees Celsius. The kind of cold that makes your breath freeze before it leaves your lungs, where the snow crunches under your boots like broken glass. Our team had been contracted to survey potential copper deposits in a region about 200 kilometers north of Norilsk, deep in the heart of the Siberian tundra, where the sun doesn't rise for 3 months of the year. The helicopter dropped us at what used to be a Soviet-era mining outpost called Severny Station. Just a collection of abandoned concrete buildings and rusted equipment scattered across the white expanse like broken teeth. The pilot, a weathered Russian named Dmitri, seemed unusually eager to leave. "You call when you're ready," he said in broken English, his eyes avoiding the dark opening in the hillside behind us. "But don't stay too long. This place, it doesn't like visitors." I dismissed his superstition as typical local folklore. Every remote area has its ghost stories, its warnings about cursed ground and restless spirits. But as our team of 4 geologists set up camp in one of the more intact buildings, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from somewhere deep beneath our feet. The abandoned mine entrance yawned about 50 meters from our temporary base camp. According to Soviet records, it had been sealed in 1987 after what the documents vaguely described as structural instabilities and worker incidents. The seal had been broken, probably by scavengers looking for scrap metal, leaving a jagged opening that seemed to breathe cold air like some massive, sleeping creature. Our initial surveys of the surface area were routine. Core samples, ground-penetrating radar, magnetic readings. Standard procedure for any geological assessment. But the readings we were getting didn't make sense. The magnetometer kept showing massive metallic anomalies deep underground, far deeper than any Soviet mine should have reached. And there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up every time I looked at the data. The seismic readings showed cavities. Huge, hollow spaces carved into the bedrock at depths that should have been solid granite. Natural caves weren't impossible, but the pattern was wrong. Too regular, too deliberate, like something had been systematically hollowed out from below. On our 3rd day, my colleague Sarah Chen, a geophysicist from Vancouver, approached me with a troubled expression. "Marcus, you need to see this," she said, holding out her tablet showing the latest acoustic readings. "We're picking up sound waves from inside the mine. Not echoes, not settling rock. Something else." The acoustic equipment we used could detect the smallest shifts in underground structures, measuring how sound traveled through rock and empty space. What Sarah had recorded defied explanation. Low-frequency vibrations were emanating from deep within the mine shaft, following patterns that were almost rhythmic. Almost like voices. "Could be wind through the tunnels," suggested James, our junior geologist, but his voice lacked conviction. We all knew what wind sounded like in underground spaces. This was different. This had cadence, variation, inflection. This sounded disturbingly like human speech. That night, as the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, I made a decision that I still regret. Against every safety protocol we'd established, I decided to investigate the mine shaft directly. Sarah and James volunteered to come with me, leaving our fourth team member, Dr. Petrov, to monitor communications from the surface. We descended into the mine at dawn, which in February Siberia meant 10 a.m. under a sky that barely managed twilight grey. Our LED headlamps cut through darkness that seemed almost solid, revealing timber supports that had rotted to black skeletons and rails that disappeared into tunnels branching off in directions that didn't match any of the Soviet mining charts. The first thing that struck me was the warmth. 50 meters underground, the temperature should have been consistently cold. Instead, we found ourselves removing outer layers as we descended further into the shaft. The walls were damp with condensation, and our breath no longer formed clouds in the beam of our lights. But it was the sounds that made us stop and listen with growing unease. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, echoing from passages that split off into the unknown, we could hear what sounded unmistakably like human voices. Muffled, distant, but undeniably there. Speaking in what sounded like Russian, but too distorted by distance and acoustics to make out individual words. "There must be other people down here," Sarah whispered, but her words carried no conviction. Our surface team had confirmed that no other vehicles or aircraft had approached the site. We were alone in this frozen wilderness, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest settlement. James checked his radio equipment. "No signal down here," he reported. "If someone else was in these tunnels, how would they have gotten past us?" We pressed deeper, following what appeared to be the main shaft. The voices grew stronger, more distinct, though still unintelligible. They seemed to be coming from multiple sources, conversations overlapping and weaving together in a symphony of human speech that shouldn't exist in this abandoned place. That's when we found the first room. About 200 meters down the main shaft, our lights illuminated an opening cut into the left wall. Not a natural cave or a mining chamber, but what looked like a deliberate excavation designed for habitation. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and carved into them were symbols that definitely weren't from any Soviet mining operation. The symbols covered every surface, spiraling patterns interwoven with what looked like Cyrillic letters, but wrong somehow. Distorted, as if someone had tried to write Russian while forgetting how the letters were supposed to look. And in the center of the room, arranged in a perfect circle, were 7 chairs. Not mining equipment, not furniture that belonged in an industrial operation. These were wooden chairs, handcrafted, positioned around what appeared to be a circular depression carved directly into the stone floor. And in that depression were bones. Human bones, but wrong. Too long, too thick, joints that bent at angles that didn't match human anatomy. As if someone had tried to construct human skeletons from memory and gotten the proportions terribly, impossibly incorrect. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to leave bruises. "Marcus," she whispered, and her voice was shaking. "The voices. They're coming from this room." She was right. The sounds we'd been following, the conversations in distorted Russian, were emanating from this chamber. But the room was empty except for the chairs, the symbols, and those impossible bones arranged in the floor depression. James set up his acoustic equipment, his hands trembling as he worked. The readings were immediate and undeniable. The voices were coming from directly beneath our feet, from somewhere far deeper than any mine shaft should extend. But that wasn't even the strangest part. Wait until you hear what happened next. As James calibrated his equipment, the voices began to change. The muffled Russian conversations we'd been hearing grew clearer, more distinct, until we could finally make out individual words. And what we heard made my blood freeze in my veins. They were talking about us. "The 3 Americans are in the first chamber," said a voice from somewhere deep below. "They found the bones. They found the chairs. Soon they will understand." "How long have they been listening?" asked another voice, this one higher pitched, almost childlike. "Since they arrived 3 days ago," replied a third. They have been hearing us call, just as the others did before them. Sarah's face had gone completely white. Marcus, she whispered, they know we're here. They know how long we've been here. They know we're Americans. But James was staring at his equipment with an expression of pure terror. Guys, he said, his voice barely audible, according to these readings, the voices aren't coming from below us. They're coming from inside this room. Right here, right where we're standing. That's when I realized the truth that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The voices weren't coming from somewhere else. They were coming from us. Not our voices as we spoke to each other, but our voices having conversations we'd never had, discussing things we'd never experienced, planning actions we'd never taken. It was as if the room, the mine, the entire underground complex was somehow extracting pieces of our consciousness and playing them back to us through speakers we couldn't see. We need to leave, I said, but even as I spoke the words, I could hear my own voice echoing from somewhere in the darkness, saying different words entirely. The drilling equipment should reach the lower chambers by midnight, my echo voice was saying. That's when we'll have access to what they left behind. We ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. 3 experienced geologists, trained to handle dangerous and unusual situations, ran like children afraid of monsters in the dark. We scrambled up that mine shaft, our headlamps bouncing crazy shadows off the rotting timber supports, while behind us the voices grew louder and more insistent. But they weren't just repeating our words anymore. They were having entire conversations in our voices about things that hadn't happened yet. Sarah's voice, distorted by distance and acoustics, discussing drill core samples we hadn't taken. James describing geological formations we hadn't discovered. And my voice, my own voice, giving detailed reports about rooms and chambers and passages that we definitely hadn't explored. We reached the surface gasping and shaking, emerging into the weak February sunlight like swimmers breaking the surface after nearly drowning. Dr. Petrov took one look at our faces and immediately began packing our equipment. We're leaving, I told him. Now. Petrov didn't ask questions. Whatever he saw in our expressions was explanation enough. Within 2 hours, we had our gear loaded and our emergency beacon activated for helicopter extraction. But as we waited for Dmitri to arrive, something happened that made me realize our underground experience was far from over. Sarah was reviewing our acoustic recordings, trying to make sense of what we'd captured, when she suddenly went rigid. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "you need to listen to this." She played back a section of audio from our time in the chamber, but cleaned up and amplified through our digital processing equipment. What we heard was impossible, but undeniably real. Our voices, having a conversation about our extraction plan, discussing the exact time Dmitri would arrive, the exact words I would use to radio for pickup, the exact route we would take back to Norilsk. A conversation that had been recorded 3 hours before any of us had made the decision to leave. How can we be hearing our voices planning something before we've planned it? James asked, but I didn't have an answer. That's when Petrov, who had been monitoring our radio equipment, looked up with an expression of confusion and growing alarm. "Dr. Webb," he said, "I'm receiving radio transmissions on our emergency frequency from someone claiming to be you, requesting immediate evacuation due to equipment failure." "But I haven't made that call yet," I said. "The transmission is time-stamped 20 minutes from now," Petrov replied. We heard the helicopter before we saw it, the distinctive thrum of rotor blades cutting through the frigid air. Dmitri set down exactly where we'd planned, at exactly the time our recorded voices had predicted. During the flight back to Norilsk, I tried to explain to Dmitri what we'd experienced. His reaction was immediate and visceral. He crossed himself 3 times and muttered something in Russian that sounded like a prayer. "You went into the speaking mine," he said, his knuckles white on the controls. "My grandfather told me about that place. Soviet miners broke through into something that had been sealed for a reason. Something that takes your words, your thoughts, your plans, and uses them for purposes you cannot understand." "What happened to the Soviet miners?" I asked. Dmitri was quiet for a long moment, concentrating on navigating through a sudden snow squall. Finally, he spoke. "They say some of them are still down there, still working the deeper shafts, still following the mining schedules, still having conversations with supervisors who died decades ago. The mine speaks with their voices now, planning expansions into territories that exist only in the spaces between thoughts." Back in Norilsk, we filed our report with the mining consortium that had contracted our survey. Equipment malfunction, they were told. Geological instabilities that made further exploration inadvisable. The site was marked for indefinite suspension of operations. But that wasn't the end of our connection to the speaking mine. For weeks after our return, all 4 team members reported the same disturbing phenomenon. We would be going about our normal lives, work meetings, family dinners, casual conversations with friends, when suddenly we would hear our own voices saying things we hadn't said, planning things we hadn't planned, discussing experiences we hadn't had. Sarah called me from Vancouver 2 months later, her voice shaking with exhaustion. "Marcus, I keep hearing myself having conversations with my sister about a trip to Russia that I never took. Detailed conversations about places I've never been, people I've never met. And my sister swears she remembers these conversations too." James reported similar experiences. His wife had become convinced that he was suffering from some form of dissociative disorder, because he would deny having conversations that she clearly remembered them having. As for me, I started keeping a digital recorder running constantly, trying to catch evidence of these phantom conversations. What I discovered was worse than I'd feared. The recordings showed that I was indeed having these conversations, speaking words I had no memory of saying, discussing plans I had no memory of making. It was as if part of my consciousness had remained in that mine shaft, continuing to exist and interact in a reality that was slightly adjacent to the one I was living in. The final revelation came 6 months after our return from Siberia. I received a package with no return address, postmarked from Norilsk. Inside was a USB drive containing audio files labeled with dates ranging from our original expedition through several months into the future. The files contained recordings of our voices. All 4 team members, having detailed conversations about returning to the mine, planning a second expedition, discussing equipment modifications, arguing about safety protocols, and ultimately agreeing to attempt contact with whatever intelligence was inhabiting the deeper chambers. These were conversations we'd never had, plans we'd never made, decisions we'd never reached. But as I listened to hour after hour of these impossible recordings, I realized with growing horror that they sounded completely reasonable. The voices were making logical arguments, following coherent lines of thought, addressing genuine scientific curiosities that I actually had about our underground experience. If someone had told me these were recordings of actual conversations, I would have believed them completely. The final file on the drive was time-stamped for a date 6 weeks in the future. In it, my voice was giving a final report about our return expedition to the speaking mine, describing discoveries in the deeper chambers, contact with entities that existed primarily as information rather than matter, and the successful establishment of a permanent research station in the depths of the Siberian underground. I was describing, in my own voice, the success of an expedition that hadn't happened yet. 2 weeks later, Sarah called. "Marcus," she said, "I think we need to go back." "What are you talking about?" I asked, but even as I spoke the words, I could feel the pull of those impossible voices calling from somewhere beneath the frozen Siberian ground. "I've been having dreams," she said. Dreams where we're back in the mine, but deeper this time. In chambers that connect to other places, other times. The voices aren't just echoes, Marcus. They're invitations. James called the next day with the same message. Dr. Petrov sent an email from Moscow, outlining a proposed return expedition with funding from sources he couldn't or wouldn't identify. And sitting in my office, staring at that USB drive of impossible conversations, I found myself seriously considering their proposals. Not because I thought it was a good idea, but because the voices in the recordings were making arguments that seemed increasingly compelling. The mine wasn't just speaking with our voices. It was thinking with our thoughts, planning with our intentions, and slowly, methodically, it was convincing us to return. If you've made it this far, you need to understand something crucial. This isn't just a story about a strange experience in a remote location. This is a warning. There are places in this world where the boundary between thought and reality becomes permeable. Places where consciousness itself can be extracted, recorded, and played back in ways that serve purposes beyond our understanding. The speaking mine is still there, still calling with voices that belong to people who thought they had left its influence behind. And according to the final recording on that USB drive, we're going back next month. Not because we want to, but because part of us never left. Part of us is still down there in those impossible chambers, having conversations that will eventually convince our surface selves to return and complete whatever process we unknowingly began. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you're hearing your own voice saying things you don't remember saying, get away immediately. Don't investigate, don't try to understand, don't attempt to make contact with whatever might be creating those phantom conversations. Because once a place like the speaking mine gets hold of your voice, it can use it to call you back home. And the most terrifying part is, when that call comes, it will sound perfectly reasonable. Let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced anything like this with recordings or voices where there shouldn't be any. And if anyone reading this is involved in geological surveys or mining operations in remote locations, be very careful about what you might uncover. Some things buried in the earth are supposed to stay buried. And some voices calling from the depths aren't asking for rescue. They're asking for company.